Just to open up, this is the last in a series about incommensurable exchange, and I like to open it with stories about other groups in New York City that are practicing the kinds of things that speakers talk about. So, as you know, this is Silvia Federici. It's an incredible honor to have her here. I thought I would give you a sense of why this series is organized by Our Goods and Trade School. Hopefully we can have a slide up here, but it's we have a map that's related to the idea of the solidarity economy that all different groups in New York City that are working on economic justice are contributing to. So Time Banks NYC and a barter network are not in competition. They actually represent initiatives that are related to the solidarity economy, which has the commons at its core. And the idea comes from this inspiring quote that Paulo Freire said, which is, "Action without reflection is blind, and reflection without action is impotent." So if we only take action without thinking about the larger political framework that we're operating within, if we don't have some sense of a larger analysis when we take action, it might feel that struggles are too difficult and we don't have a wider awareness or consciousness about how hard it is to do some of the things that we're trying to do. And on the flip side of that, if we operate only in academia and love problems, investigating problems without actually trying to take action or experience the nuance of the thing we're working on, it'll be somewhat impotent. So this helps me think through why bring speakers in who can help us see a larger framework for the initiatives that a lot of people in this room are working on. If you look at this map, hopefully, this is by Ethan Miller, who talks a lot about the solidarity economy, and it could be organized in many ways. Art and Labor is another group that's made a great booklet of groups in New York City that a lot of people in this room worked on and are involved in. And solidaritynyc.org, if you go to the next image, is working on this map that anyone can contribute to. So if you go to solidaritynyc.org and you're interested in how different groups in New York City are trying to work together, that was the group that brought me and Jesse in touch with each other. So Our Goods is a barter network, and that might seem very similar to time banking, and it is. And for us, what's interesting is seeing how all of these different initiatives can band together to recognize that the memberships have common goals and that we don't need to compete with each other as small-scale initiatives. We need to recognize that we all have a common struggle that people like Silvia Federici can help us understand. I think what's really inspiring about Silvia is that her work is not one that's separate from action and activism, and that she's always put the two together. So we were talking about not staying silent and making sure that even as an academic, you speak truth and you don't hide your politics at work. So I'm really honored to have her here. And before we welcome her, I thought we could hear a little bit more about time banking from Jesse. Thanks.
So just really quickly, in case you guys have not heard of time banking before, there's actually several time banks in the city, and again, they're pretty friendly with each other. But the time bank that I work for is called Time Banks NYC, and it's a free resource for anyone 18 years and older, as well as organizations, to exchange skills and services using time as currency. So an hour for an hour. And if anybody wants to know more about it, I'll be here after the talk, and I can talk to you more about it. And I also just wanted to mention very quickly that in connection to time banking and bartering and the Solidarity NYC and the Solidarity economy in New York City, there are several organizations now that are trying to do a little bit more trading within the Solidarity economy. And they're calling themselves the Solidarity Economy Skillshare. So it's still a very early thing, but it's several organizations. Some are worker cooperatives, some are time banks, some are barter things that are trying to work together to funnel skill sharing amongst those initiatives in particular. If anyone's interested, I'd also be happy to tell you about it. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much. We're honored to have you.
Well, good evening, and thank you for coming tonight, and also thank you, Caroline, for inviting me here, and also thank you for all the work that you have done to really, raise consciousness about the fact that another world is possible, and another world based on cooperation, rather than on competition and reciprocal decimation, as this seems to be the trend that is prevailing nowadays, especially in this country. I'm going to change a little bit the format of my presentation tonight from what I had decided, because I was going to begin directly with the question of gender and the commons, but I realized that perhaps the idea of the commons may still need some more discussion. And so I will begin to say that it's very interesting and not surprising that the idea of the commons in the last at least 15 years, at least the last 2 decades, has become so prevalent in the discussion, in the discourse of various radical groups. At the same time, I think it's a concept that still needs a lot of clarification, because I think we are facing a danger, and the danger is that the idea of the commons, rather than becoming an alternative to the present society, to the present social order, to an alternative to the system of capitalist development, may actually become the last shore on which capitalism can regenerate itself. And I think I want to say a few things, because many of the discussion that I have nowadays with people center precisely on this question: how can we ensure, and of course there is no clear line, divisory line, but how can we ensure that the efforts that we make, to create different forms, very different forms of social relations that are more cooperative, different forms of relationship to the means of our reproduction, to the natural wealth all around us, that based on a much more communal principle, based on the principle of sharing, of communal, basically care for the wealth that is around us. How can we ensure that these efforts are not being co-opted and in a way turned against us? And I think it's important that we realize that today there is a whole trend of activities, and there's also a trend of discussions that promotes the commons as really a third form between the public and the private, but not as a real alternative to capitalism, but something in fact that can make capitalism more humane, if possible, and can in fact represent a buffer, between the two. And in a way, it's a conception of the commons that tries to create spaces that humanize the present system, which I don't believe is possible, rather than looking at the principle of the common as a true alternative, as a principle that transforms society, that transforms our relationship. And this is the spirit in which I will be speaking about the commons tonight. And I will look also at the question of gender, what a gender perspective can contribute to the discussion and organization of the commons. And now, most of the comments I'm going to make are very much shaped by my experience in the feminist movement over the years, but they're also shaped by some of the developments that have taken place, at least since the 80s, across the world, but particularly in the countries that are much improperly labeled at times as the third world. In Africa, Latin America in particular. There's been a very interesting development that have taken place, particularly in response to the type of attack that has been waged against the population of these regions, since the early 80s, through the process of globalization, through the imposition of neoliberal agenda, through the so-called program of structural adjustment, which have impoverished, pauperized millions of people, literally stripping them of their lands, of their employment, their forms of employment. And as you probably know, the program of structural adjustment that was imposed by the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, on many countries of the third world in the early 80s, in the name of economic recovery and in response to the so-called debt crisis, right, which was a crisis that was artificially created, particularly through the change in the cost of the dollars at the beginning of the 80s. So that all of a sudden countries that had borrowed money abroad and had debt that had been manageable until that time found themselves in a debt that was irredeemable. And so these very, very austere politics were imposed that pauperized millions of people. Well, in response to this pauperization, there was often accompanied also by political repression, because you cannot impoverish millions of people without at the same time instituting some form of dictatorship, some form of repression, because of course they will protest, they will revolt. Chile in 1973, in fact, was the first example, right? It was the beginning of that process. And the coup in 1973 was aimed to, in fact, do that. Was the open door to a neoliberal agenda, right? Now, I'm going to speak a bit now, first of all, about the response that have taken place in reaction to the pauperization, the austerity programs that were imposed, as I said, starting in the 80s, but have continued, almost to the present, at least in a number of regions. But first of all, I want to say that the central concept of my talk this evening is to say that the gender perspective, and in particular a perspective that is shaped by a feminist viewpoint, and is shaped by concern that are inspired by the struggle that women have made, it brings to the commons the idea of reproduction. In other words, looks at the commons, the contribution that it does, that it makes to the concept of the common and the practice of the common, is that it takes the principle of the common as the principle through which we can think, or the transformation of our reproduction, of all that range of activities that on a day-to-day basis reproduce our life, beginning with all those activities that have often been labeled as domestic work, but also beyond domestic work, including the work of care for the environment, and as well as cultural activity, the production of knowledge, which also goes with the work of reproduction. So again, gender to me in relation to the common, and in particular a feminist or women's perspective, and I know that this is a controversial point, so I'm going to confront this question in the course of my talk. But it means, first of all, centering the idea of the common on the question of reproduction. I would like to say that, in fact, when you look at the literature that has been produced over the last 10 years on the subject of the common, you'll see that there is almost a gender divide. You'll find that a lot of the literature that has been actually written by men on this topic, right, looks at the common from the point of view mostly of the internet. For example, if you look at the material produced by Marxist autonomists like Anton Negri and Michael Hart, you will see that their model, the model that they have in mind, in fact, they say very openly to them of the communalization of relation, of sharing a shared communal wealth, is the internet. And in fact, they say the internet is the ideal common, because it is also a space where when you take from it, you don't deplete it, but you actually add to it. Right? Every use of the internet common is a use that expands it rather than depleting it. Right? So they look at as that they privilege, right? They privilege the internet, and whereas when you look at the way, in fact, the women have been talking about, and I'm thinking of writers like Maria Mies in Germany, Vandana Shiva in India. The discussion has always been in relation to the question of the organization of the neighborhood, the organization of domestic work. So there is, in fact, a gender divide. And I'm going to speak to it, not because I want to confirm the gender divide, but because I believe that it is important to see some of the reasons why it remains crucial not to look at this issue from the viewpoint of an abstract universal subject. Why it still remains important to actually look at it from a gender perspective. Now, the experiences I was referring to before, in a way coming from Africa, coming from Latin America, in a way confirm, I think in a way they give us a clue why a gender perspective is still important. Briefly put, starting with the mid-1980s and through the 90s, what we have seen taking place in many different countries, and again, Latin America is possibly the region in which these experiences have been most pronounced and most significant, both numerically, but also from the point of view of their impact in the transformation of social relation. What we have begun to see is that in response to a situation of extreme political repression and extreme economic repression, of massive austerity, leading many people to basically not having the fundamental, the most basic means to reproduce themselves, women quite massively a step forward. There is an abundant literature now on this topic. So if you are interested in learning more and to see the documentation, the evidence for yourself, I can actually give you references of books that now have begun to collect that information, but it's now quite documented. Women have begun to step forward and literally, slowly, have begun to transform their neighborhood, their territory, through a myriad, a set of initiatives that have really not only changed the power relations, not only have enabled people, millions of people to survive, but have also created the beginning of a different form of reproduction, taking place outside of the control of the market and out of the control of the state. Starting with Chile in the years after the coup of 1973, at a time in which 30,000 people have been disappeared, imprisoned, massacred, in which the majority of the population was terrorized, particularly people in the working class, indigenous people were terrorized. Actually, women, because of their relationship to the process of reproduction, because they had to take care of the children, because they had, through their engagement in reproduction, they had relationship with each other. The women were, in fact, the first to step forward and to begin, in a way, that process of reconnecting, reweaving together a social fabric that had been completely torn apart. And at the center of the process, they all began to create a whole set of initiatives that were extremely important. Initiatives such as collective kitchens, the Ola Comunes, collective kitchens whereby they'll begin to cook together. Also committees for shopping together. Because if you shop together in a situation of very, very high inflation, actually you can pool your resources. That idea that pooling your resources, in fact, gives you the possibility of saving on the cost of your reproduction. Gardening, urban farming. So a whole network of urban. In this process, also, they began to, in a way, break down the isolation in which the dictatorship had plunged people and the sense of terror and impotence and weakness. They came with that. They came with the physical repression to which so many people have been subjected. The same developments also took place later in Peru, and later again in Argentina, and again in very, very similar format. It's extremely amazing, actually, when you look at the kind of reconstruction of society that has taken place, and it's something that I think you'll find it very interesting if you familiarize yourself with it. There is documentation that shows, for example, in Lima, Peru, these developments were taking place particularly in the poorest areas, in particularly the urban periphery, the barrios, the squatted encampments, the squatted settlements, because many people who had to leave the countryside because the land was gone would come to the city and then squat in the cities. So this was the scenario in which this activity in many cases were organized. In Lima in the mid-1980s, it's calculated that you had at least 15,000 women's organizations. 15,000 organizations. What were these organizations? All developing around the area of reproduction and reconstructing reproduction in a communal basis. So, for example, one example of this initiative, of this commoning initiative that rebuilt the different aspects and moments of reproduction on a communal cooperative basis, would be the committees for the glass of milk. The committee for the glass of milk to ensure that the children would at least would have every day a glass of milk in a situation of rampant malnutrition. And in Lima, it's calculated that you had, at any particular point through the 80s, you'd have 2,000, 2,500 committees for the glass of milk. Similar, you had the committees for, again, shopping together, committees for cooking together, committees for gardening. In Lima, there will be calculated 7,000, 8,000 common kitchens in the neighborhoods, serving on an average 500,000 meals on a day-to-day basis. Often the way they were organized, you'd have groups of women, 10, 15 women or 20 women coming together and in a particular neighborhood, in a particular barrio, organizing themselves for how to doing their shopping together, how doing their cooking together, right? How doing the gardening together, and connected with that a variety of other activities. Now the experience, the significance of this development, yeah, which took place again, basically created a whole system of reproduction. A system of reproduction that in many ways continues to these days, and a system of reproduction that was not dependent, that was increasingly becoming independent of the market and independent of the state, right? It's the importance of it has been not only the economic value and the survival value that it has afforded to people, the fact that in many cases it has made a difference between life and death, which of course is a tremendous achievement, but also the fact that through these common inactivities, right, you had in a way the beginning of an alternative system of life and a transformation, a profound transformation of social relation. You know, first of all, breaking down at the moment of great fear, a fear of repression, fear of starvation, fear of a world with no future, breaking down the isolation among people, bringing people together, communizing not only the shopping, but communizing the pain, you know, communizing the knowledge, so that these commons became, as we have experienced also with the urban gardens here, the vehicle for a tremendous circulation of knowledge. Right? People speak to each other as they are working cooperatively. They exchange a lot of experiences. They develop bonds of trust with each other. They begin to help each other beyond the shopping, right? Beyond the cooking, so that the cooking and the shopping, in a way, you know, become the vehicle for something different that is created. A whole process in which people begin regaining control over their life and begin to realize that their life can be very different if it is lived in common, if it is lived cooperatively, collectively, that they do not depend any longer on their own meager strength and meager means, but in fact, they have a whole support system and a whole support group behind them on which they can fall back in case of extreme need. And this situation is also changed, and this is recorded in many different ways, the relationship between women and men. Because the women have supported each other not only in the cooking and in the shopping and in the gardening and in the provisioning of a glass of milk to the children and many others of such activity, but in the process have also supported each other in defense, both against the police and against, for example, the male in their family, the husband or the brothers, who, when they abuse them, right? So that there is clearly these activities have had not only an economic impact, but have also been a moment of transformation, an instrument of transformation and changing the position of women in society and in the position of women in their communities. Now, I've spoken about the experience of Chile and Peru, but there are many other examples that come from Africa, for instance. There's been, through the 90s to these days, a massive movement of land squatting, but also led by women in many cases, but also a movement of urban gardening, whereby women have taken over pieces of land in the city, wherever land was not used, wherever land was not occupied, and they began to garden it to such an extent that some sociologists have noted that in Africa today, in many of the capitals, the separation between town and country has been broken down because part of the cities, from Kinshasa to other cities, other capitals, really look like gardens. Also want to mention many other examples, again coming in this case from Latin America, the involvement of women in the movement of piqueteros, which has been extremely important, to which they have brought these common activities. During the piquetes, it was the women who organized the Ola Comunes, who organized the process of reproduction, particularly in relation to cooking and feeding people, in relation to provisioning of the food, and so forth. In Colombia, the Madres Comunitarias, in similar circumstances, have begun a broad initiative to create communal centers in which women, pooling their resources, have begun to actually take care of children. Children would have no place to go when their mother would be going outside for a job outside the home. And they have begun. The Madre Comunitarias now, just recently, the last couple of years, have been able to actually get some support from the state. So actually now they do receive a certain amount of funds from the state, but until now, for many, many years, they were actually organizing themselves on the basis of pooling their resources. Another classical system, this however has much older roots and is a system that extends from Asia to Africa, is the system of what is often called the tontines, which is the system whereby women who are very poor put together their resources, put together a certain amount of money every month, every week, so that they have a little capital in case of need, in case on which they can fall back. This, of course, is widely different. In fact, is exactly the opposite of the system of microfinance, which is organized by the World Bank and by many banks and NGOs, which is, in fact, is a disaster system that is supposed to empower women, is supposed to actually give women entry into the money economy. And in fact, it has transformed thousands and thousands of women across the world who formerly had at least support groups behind them. It has transformed into people who are into severe debt and into such debt that in many cases they have become really slaves to the bank. Not unlike what is taking place here in this country, with students trying to get an education and are now basically indentured servant to the banks. So these experiences, to me, are very important because they show the experiences I've mentioned of the way reproduction, the organization of reproduction, has been transformed in a number of regions through the last 2-3 decades. It's extremely important because it shows that the commoning, the reorganization of this work, of reproductive work, on a commons basis is not a utopia, but is something that is possible. And not only is possible, but is actually incredibly transformative and extremely necessary, indispensable. And certainly these are experiences that we cannot transport from Bolivia or Argentina or Peru to New York, but they are an incredible inspiration because I think that something similar has to happen also in the United States, and not to mention also other countries of the world. It has to happen also here. We need to be able to reorganize because the problems that we're encountering are very much the same. We are very much in a similar situation, although to a different degree, that many millions of people encountered in the 80s and 90s when they were subjected to the politics of structural adjustment and the full impact of the neoliberal agenda. We are in a situation now, and I think it's becoming every day more clear, in which the most basic means of our reproduction are not available to us. And not only they're not available to us, right, but we are at a turning point, an historical turning point, in which we have a state that basically tells us that our reproduction, it's our responsibility. That in fact, nothing is owed to us. That no matter how much work we do, in fact, reproducing ourselves from the point of view of health, housing, employment, etc., this is our responsibility, right? And I think we know that the famous crisis of the welfare state, it's basically an historic turn that opens up a new era of capitalism, in which the kind of compromise that capitalism had made, at least for a certain period of time, under the impact of very high levels of struggle, right? Because it's very clear that what we call the welfare state, which is the provision of certain benefits, the provision of certain support measures to our reproduction, was not granted, but actually was conquered with tremendous struggle. But now we are in a different moment in which we are actually told, and every minute, that basically nothing is granted to us, and we have to resort to the market if we want to reproduce ourselves. And we have already seen what resorting to the market has led us to. We have already seen it from the point of view of healthcare. We have seen it from the point of view of housing. We have seen it from the point of view of education, with the millions of students who now face a future governed by their debt. So that the idea of actually, transforming the society, transforming the system of our reproduction, and first of all, recreating a base. And this, to me, is probably at the moment, one of the most important aspects of the common, of the struggle for the common. Unlike in many parts of Latin America, we really do not have a community. Today, a community in many parts of the United States, for instance, is a fiction. We keep speaking of community and community, but actually there's no community. I was very struck 2 weeks ago at the meeting on the Commons to hear from people who have been working with Occupy Sandy. When they went to Rockaway, this is a very poor community. We say it's a very poor community, right? They discovered that even people very poor hardly knew each other. Actually, many of the people they talked to had not talked to the neighbor next door, until the hurricane, until the disaster hit them, right? So it was the first time that there was a moment of cooperation. This is to say, to what extent? And it's not an accident, because the kind of restructuring, economic restructuring, gentrification that we have witnessed, in the recent years, has basically torn apart whatever there was of a community. Relationship that had been built over many, many years and over decades of struggle, right, have gone. The industrial Northeast, for example, it becomes a desert area. I remember in the late 70s, when the big factory shut down. That was the end not only of a certain industrial system, but it was the end of entire communities who had certain bonds of solidarity and therefore had a certain capacity of resistance. Right? I think that we encounter so much repression, economic and otherwise today, is because those forms of solidarity, those forms of organization that were extremely important as a base of resistance to the state, today are not there any longer. So in a way, the commons is not only an objective, it's not only something that we should struggle to achieve it in the future, but it's even a condition, is even a precondition as a sort of a base. Because without certain bonds of solidarity, We cannot even negotiate, for example, with the public realm. So the sorting resources are made available to us. Right? So the sorting, the wealth that we produced is not continuously taken away from us, but actually can be left in our hands and can be returned to our hands. So the common as a base, to me, is an extremely important concept. And I believe that the experience of the communities, the barrios of Latin America, where we are seeing this initiative coming from women, and rethinking the process of reproduction, recreating the process of reproduction, is important for us as well. It's important because the reproduction, it's really the fundamental terrain on which we begin to transform our social relation. I was very impressed by the experience of the Occupy movement, to see how that being together the people experience and beginning to solve together certain basic problem. How do you get food? How do you distribute it? How do you organize a cleaning team? How do you structure space? Etc., etc. That experience was extremely important, in terms of beginning to create a whole new, different type of relationship that you do not have if you spend all your days in front of the computer. If you spend your days in front of, a computer screen, right? And not accidentally, so many, particularly younger people's life, were completely transformed by that experience. And so in that sense, reproduction is really the first terrain in which we can not only begin to confront the question of our survival, which has so many sides and so many dimensions, but where we can also begin to create a different world. We can begin to create a different relationship. Now, why women? Right? Why women? I know that when I say that it's important to have a feminist or women's perspective on the question of reproduction, immediately, generally, there's always a lot of protests. Well, why women? Right? After all, this is something that concerns men as well. This is very true. Obviously, it's not a concern only for women. But at the same time, historically, and to this day, I think what we have seen is that the initiative of the transformation of reproductive activity on a day-to-day basis has come from women, and is not an accident. Because to this day, it's women who are the main subject of reproductive work. Most of the reproductive work, particularly the one that we look at as domestic work, is done by women. No matter how many jobs women have outside the home, even if 80% of women today, which actually the figure is less, but have occupation outside the home, nevertheless, most of the work of reproduction is done by them. And is done in a situation that is of isolation, and a situation that places their life, our life, in a continuous crisis. In a continuous crisis because their work has to be done with very minimal resources. Is work that is being done added to other tasks, like earning an income, because in many cases, particularly if they do not have a husband who can support them, who can add to the family budget, you are responsible for bringing an income at home, right? And is work that cannot be technologized, right? One of the reasons we have to transform reproductive work is because this is work that cannot be done, cannot be organized in the way it has been organized so far. It cannot be performed by one person alone or by one family alone. In fact, historically, the reproduction of human beings was always taken care of by broad, extended families and communities. If you look at different societies throughout history, you find that many, many of the tasks of reproduction were collective tasks. They were not tasks who basically fell on the shoulders of one particular person, as it has been often the case in our society. And think in particular, I've been very interested in the question of elder care as well as child care, but especially of elder care, perhaps because I'm aging. And so the question of elder care is now becoming very much also a personal as well as a collective concern. But the situation, for example, of elder care really calls for the collectivity. Today, caregivers are in a state of absolute crisis, so much so that in many cases they themselves need to be cared for, because they themselves are at risk of falling ill, given the stress, given the exhaustion that comes from their work. So we need to transform reproduction because we need actually to rethink and reappropriate, reclaim, the social wealth that is available, which now is used to kill people, now is used for war upon war upon war, and for millions of policemen that are going to basically repress our life, when we need to rechannel their wealth. But also we need it because we have to transform their world. We need to transform the work in a way that it becomes a cooperative venture, a cooperative initiative. And I believe that if it becomes a cooperative initiative, if it's not organized in the poverty that now characterize it, and if it's not organized in the dire isolation that today characterize it, we can begin to discover that reproductive work can actually be creative work, and not a kind of work from which, as a woman or as a man, we run away from. Thank you. Bye. Thank you.
Okay, hopefully someone's working on this.
Ha.
I don't know, I'm sorry, I don't know what's going on.
Ha.
It's too controversial for this location.
Ha. So this is the process of the...
I think hopefully they're working on it, but we're recording this, so if you have a question, it'd be good if you could talk into the microphone. Yeah, I'm just gonna...
Is there a microphone going?
I have them, so if you raise your hand, I can bring you the mic if you have a question.
All right, yeah. Sylvia, yeah, the question is really more to come back to the beginning of the talk, the kind of preface you gave in terms of how the commons can also be retooled in a way, like what George talks about, this kind of plan B of neoliberalism. And I think in a way, especially over these last few years, I see that potential is even greater. And I know in terms of the last capitalist crisis, let's say in the 70s, and I feel like for sure we're going through one now. There was this kind of result in a way that the struggles produced a kind of the new sort of version of capitalism that we've been living through the last 30, 40 years. So. And I see in a way that our own creativity and thinking around this, as well as things like solidarity economies and all of these kind of initiatives, have this danger, right, that we're confronted with of in a way, conceptualizing and softening the most severe parts of this economic system, and in a way also paving the way and inventing its the sort of new form that it will have to take. And so the question is really how do we guard against that? I mean, what kind of and if we go back to these historic examples, let's say that you're talking from the 70s to the present in different places, what kinds of processes will be necessary in a way to protect that? That's a really big question, I think, that we're thinking about together. So
I think the first step is really to begin to see what are these other form of commons that are being promoted, right? And to learn, for example, the World Bank has been, has capitalized on the concern that people have for the state of the world's ecosystem. Right? The fact that the air is continuously more polluted, etc., and they have now engaged, for many years now, appointed themselves as the promoters of the global common. This notion of we are the protectors of the heritage of humanity. The United Nations also takes that position, and the notion of the global commons. Right? So, for example, under the guise of protecting the global commons, they have expelled many indigenous communities from the forests in which they have been able to live. And then, then they have opened the forest to people who could pay, right? For example, with ecotourism or game parks, etc. And so with this idea, of course, that, the market is the most rational way of utilizing resources. The market is the good for all. And so we begin to say no to the idea of global commons. There's no such a thing as global commons, because the idea of a commons, of a shared wealth, right, of shared land, shared forest, shared coastal seas, fisheries, and so on, right, implies always a community, a collectivity that not only uses their land, not only uses the forest, but also cares for them, also gives back to them, regenerates them. So the commons not only as a wealth to be used, appropriated, and shared, but as a system of obligations. Right? As a system of obligation, as a system of reciprocity. You take, but you give back. I think that the principle of the Native population of the United States and America has been very important, right? That you come to this earth and you live it in such a way that the next 7 generations can still use it. Now we can, yes. So for example, we say no to the global common because now the World Bank has erected itself as a global subject. We don't have a global subject, right? So we'll have communities who will be responsible and will use certain areas, certain resources, certain wealth. And those communities will connect, will interconnect. And this is how we can begin to think of different ways of organizing our future, our production and reproduction. Right? But there's no such a thing as a global and the World Bank certainly is not our global representative, right? So this is, for example, is one way. A second way is also, the global. There are now many initiatives that call themselves commons, but they are built on the principle of exclusion, right? So people have discovered that it's very good. They actually, if you are in a group, which is really but if you are bargaining or organizing as a group, whether a consumer, you make a consumer group, or you are, for example, in housing, you can have more power and better results. Very true. And so you have these gated communities built on homogeneity, no diversity, no strangers, no aliens, no people who do not belong to your income level. And you have what we call gated community built on the principle of exclusion. Now, to me, fundamentally, and this is one reason also the issue of why gender, why still insisting on the question of gender. You know, the most fundamental principle of the common. You cannot have a common unless you organize in such a way that addresses and challenges and subvert directly the kind of division, racial, sexual, along age lines, along different forms of ethnicity that characterize this society. There is no commons where there is inequalities of power. So the most fundamental and the most constitutive element of a non-cooptable commons, is a commons that refuses, right? That really, truly is built on egalitarian relation, and is built not only on egalitarian relation, but on the subversion and of in fact, what today exists, which is a profoundly, racialized society in all kinds of ways. So I think if we begin to look at it that way, I think we can begin to steer away from the possibility that the commons that we create are actually turned against us, right? And actually, so that we are surrounded by a whole set of islands, built on exclusionary relations. That's the best. And of course, we have to think, right, that I often speak today of transition commons, because obviously the communal relation that we build today will still be enmeshed in all kinds of, residue from the society in which we live. Right? You cannot have a pure island, in a society of capitalist relation. So I speak of transitional common, but there are certain things that are very fundamental, that the moment in which you ignore those things, then you immediately, stepped into commons that can be really turned against us. Yes.
I think that when we think about so collaborative consumption is very popular now.
Yes.
It's basically like synchronized swimming of individual
Right.
lives, right? So it's So it's really there's nothing collaborative about it. It's like doing the hustle at the
Yes.
same time, right? So nobody really wants to talk about collaborative generation and this idea that it's not really reciprocity. I'm going to disagree. I'm going to say that I don't think that's enough. I think when you produce something, you have to produce for at least 2 other people, not just enough. So when I take something from you because I need it, and you come to me because you need something, I need to give you what you need and a little bit more. And it's that. So the idea of actually institutionalizing generosity as a kind of currency, as a kind of safeguard and buffer for vulnerability, is, I think, one of the really interesting ways that Occupy, in its various avatars and shapes, continues to thrive, because I think it's a system. It's an animal that considers its parts. It's sort of like it's kind of cool that way. So I feel that collaborative consumption, I mean, it's no surprise that Avis acquired Zipcar.
Yeah.
Zipcar is Avis, but for people that live in Brooklyn, pretty much. So, I mean, it's a different set of emperor's clothes, I think, right? I mean,
Yeah.
so can you speak like really honestly about generosity and the absence of it in transitional commons?
Generosity as a form of social relation, as a form of currency. But
Yeah.
I think, yes, I see. Obviously, it is a principle that should be supported not only in the commons, but even outside of the commons, I think is one of the great principles of human life, right? That the process of giving is a process that adds to your wealth rather than taking away from what you have. So this is one of, it's like, but as a principle of currency, it seems to me that, again, the question, first of all, let me put it this way. I think that the commons will take many, many different forms. Even today, when we look at the different tradition of commons from Europe or from Latin America, we see that there are many different types of relation, like the Bolivian AILU, which is really built mostly on reciprocity, right? That we always work collectively. I built your house, and then you help me to build my house. Okay, that's one system of commons, but it's built on the idea that we are together and we share the resources that we have, and one of the resources is our labor, right? Other forms of commons are built on collective work, collective decision making, right? Collective sharing. And this question, the reciprocity is not necessarily so amplified. To me, the question of generosity is a beautiful principle. Of course, it's a principle I try to observe in my life, and I would like to put as one of those things that we select as ideal for the society we want to build. But I cannot really speak it in the abstract. It's very difficult to speak about it in the abstract. Perhaps you can enlighten us a bit more.
So
but I need to see much more, you know, what that means.
So that would be the principle of, for example, when you harvest for your own household, and you have extra stuff left over in the, I mean, you've already sorted out your household, but you've planted in such a way that you will always have extra stuff, and you bring those extra.
That's not generosity.
No, wait. It's you bring those extra products to a place, a commonly held place, and you deposit them there. So the strategy is that it's not that you're just taking care of yourself, but you're taking care of another or maybe two others. And your operations cost or your budget horizon, whatever currency you're exchanging, factors in more than just you. And I'm curious about it as an economic practice. So it's not occasional. It's not like, okay, if you get, during Thanksgiving, you get an extra can of food and you leave it in a basket as you exit the grocery store. Or occasionally you spend an extra $1 at Duane Reade for HIV, whatever. So not episodic or occasional.
Yes. I like to say this. You know, I've always liked Brecht when... Bertolt Brecht, when I cannot remember now exactly the phrasing, right? But the idea was something like this. Let's rely less on people's disposition, and let's rely more on good structures, so that we don't have to actually appeal to our morality, but we actually have a structure where being a good person does not cost.
Oh no,
yeah.
I'm not interested.
So
exactly.
Yeah. So in my conception of the commons would be such that if we actually have justice in the way we organize, and cooperation and justice in the way we organize what is available to us in any particular region and so on, then we wouldn't necessarily have to. Generosity will be something that people will exercise, but that the very organization of the society, the very organization of reproduction, of the way wealth is made available, of the way work is organized, will already guarantee that each of us participate in a system of justice, that we have what our needs, what is necessary to meet our needs. And that I would like to start from there, since we are so far from that ideal, that it would be, but maybe it'll be interesting. I would like you to write or something about generosity and the commons. That would be great. I would really love to see it.
Hi. So my question is a question about the relationship between micro and macro. You're very clear that we resist capitalism and the sort of metaphorical and physical enclosure of commons, both with our smaller, sort of more micro commons, and that we do that in our everyday lives, and not forget about sort of all the products that we use and the blood that goes into them, etc. You're very clear that we do that, and also that we never forget that we very much need to resist global capitalism in its global large scale forms. So could you talk about the bridge between the two? Like, is the smaller scale just meant to be a model or an organizing tool, or how does it actually happen that we get to the macro?
I think the macro is right in our kitchen. The macro is right in our kitchen. Every time we throw away the trash, we're dealing with the macro. I always wonder where the trash that I throw away, in whose garden, in whose field, right? In whose lungs that trash is going to end, right? I don't think that today we have to look for the macro. The macro is all around us, you know. And I first of all, I do not see the commons only as these little scale experiments, right? Some may start small scale, some may start bigger scale. You know, across the world, communal relation can be formed in so many ways. I'm reminded, you know, my partner has lived many years in Maine, and the whole coast of Maine is made of lobster fishermen who have organized. They're working for the market, so they're actually selling the lobsters. So this is not yet a non-capitalist common. They're selling, but they are organized around commons. And this is all along the coast of Maine, and that's a big thing, right? So the commons come in different form. Once we begin to think of the principle, we also begin to recognize the commons that are around, or the commons that we have lost, and recognize that we doesn't have to have the little patch of land, the little garden, the little etc., right? But aside from that, I would say that really the issue of connecting with the global is continuous, right? Because, I mean, using the example of trash, imagine if we organized in our neighborhood about dealing with trash in a responsible way, looking at our trash as a negative common, right? As something that we could make, because the idea of the common is also to retake responsibility for our lives. We now live in a situation of also irresponsibility in many ways. I'm not making a moral issue out of it. I'm not making a moral issue because that's how our life are organized, right? I throw out something in the garbage, right? I feel bad, but I don't know what else to do. I can try to recycle, but I don't have a control where this is going. But what if we really try in some ways to actually become involved in controlling, in reclaiming, in retaking responsibility? That's a very long type of work. But this is the kind of work also that we need to do. Because to me, commons also means to live in a way that is cooperative, not only for the people who are involved immediately, but that applies the principle of cooperation on a global scale. Not because they are global commons, but because what happens in my little commons will have repercussion for commons. Now, you know, remember the boats? They used to go full of trash. United States in the 70s or 80s, many, many times, there'll be this huge ship full of trash that the United States will ship out, looking for the country to take it. You know, sometimes with chemical, basically chemical debris, etc., etc. So I think we can apply that principle to everything. We can apply it to principles. So the connection is already there. Yes.
Sorry, I was working and I could not get here. But the title is what attracted me, so I missed that. Could you please give a quick, something? Because these women are going to ask me, well, reproductive, collective, what, commons, what are you talking about, Lupe? So that will be helpful.
Good. Yeah, I was talking, I refer, there's been this discussion, right, of, mostly in response to the kind of savage privatization drive that neoliberalism has pushed since with the globalization process, with the liberalization of the economy, so that everything is privatized. Yeah? Everything is commercialized. Every aspect of our life is now commercialized. You have to pay for this. You have to pay for that. We are losing really access to the world in very significant ways. I foresee, if this is the trend that continues, right, I foresee a world where we will not have access to forests, to fisheries, to seas, to beaches, to space. It's already happening. In New York, there's very little that you can access without paying for it, right? And this is happening now on a global scale, so that everything has a price tag. At the same time that people have less and less access to money, access to employment, nevertheless. So in response to this, right, you have had in the 80s and 90s millions, entire communities across the world who have found themselves with no resources, right, with no resources. And so many of these communities, I was explaining at the beginning of my talk, that in many of these communities, and Latin America has been really one outstanding place. There's all kinds of historical reasons why probably that is the case. But in many of these communities, women have stepped forward and have begun to create another economy around the issue of reproduction, right? They began to basically, when their communities had no more money, no more land, no more, to come forward and come together. Basically, they have pooled their misery together, and they've begun to see what together they could do and create mothers' committees, glass of milk committees, cooking committees, with the idea that, if we work together, if we don't do it all separately in our little houses, right, like we live, all separate, if we actually begin to create reproduction in a more cooperative way. Let's have, in a neighborhood, let's have a communal kitchen so that we actually cook together. And they discovered that actually this cooking together was very beneficial. That actually they could stretch whatever limited budget they had. They could cooperate also in provisioning resources. And they also gave strength to each other. Right? Also the importance of not feeling alone. When you are desperate, you don't know where to turn. And yet, you are with other women, you share the misery, you talk, and you have ideas, and that they gave themselves a lot of strength. And this experience has proliferated, so that you have the shopping together committee, and then gardening, beginning to take pieces of land and growing some food. So that, for example, the 80s and 90s, and is still happening, right? The idea of urban gardening has been a phenomenon of the last 30 years. In Africa, in Latin America, mostly women. Because, why women? right? Why women? There's something, clearly because women are the ones who have had to take care of the reproduction. And in many cases, when the poverty has reached a certain level, the family fell apart. So often men went off, migrated. Or in any case, when the wage, right? In fact, there was a recentering of politics away from the union, away from the factories, away from the wage workplace, because many of those outfits shut down, right? So the union went off in a way similar to the United States and even more extreme. So the actually political work recentered around the community. And whereas in the past it would be the man, the union, the Socialist Party, the Marxist organization, etc., by the 90s it was the women. By the 90s it was the women, it was reproduction, and it was the community. They became the new center, right? Something similar also happened politically. I don't know, I'm sure all of you are aware of the situation with the Madres de la Plaza de Mayo in Argentina. Right? At the moment in which the left was, and everybody, working class people, were under tremendous attack, and where they, you fear even to breathe, right? The women stepped forward, and they made of their children a common, right? They stepped forward, and they actually, in some ways, there's something there. That these were housewives. These were women that had no political experience.
Well, that's what I want to ask you to get a little specific on, because these are going to be sexual women, and they're going to say to me, did she talk about commons, reproduction, sex in common? That's what their thinking is going to be. So I really want you to get me clear, because I'm going to be the one who goes back and tries to explain that part, Like they're going to think that, did she mean that we should have sex in common, you see? That's what they're
sex in common.
Yes, because from the title.
So that's why I talk about gender rather than sexual, just not to make sure. Yes, that no, we are talking about the fact of reorganizing reproductive work, reproduction. By reproduction, I do not mean giving birth. I do not mean that process, which is not even. Although there is something to be said about that too. Because in the past, women gave birth not by themselves, not with a doctor, but in a community. For example, in Europe, you have many, many descriptions, painting. We are in a museum. There's a lot of paintings of European, life scene, everyday life scene, where you see the woman giving birth, and she's held by the other women, right? That the idea that you give birth with a doctor is something that only the 19th century, I think, begins to really become prominent. Not before. I mean, before it begins in the 17th, but in any case, by reproduction, it means all the sphere of activities, right? They have to do with the recreation of our day-to-day life and energy, capacities, which is physical, actually reproductive work. It's a very interesting work because it's work where you can never separate, right? Reproductive work, I mean work that reproduces human beings. You can produce a table or you can produce a human being, right? These are two different types of work, very different. And reproductive work, which I use for the production of human beings, it's very different. You cannot separate the physical, the emotional, the intellectual, right? Today is very fashionable in some areas of the left to speak of material and immaterial labor. Dealing with reproduction, that distinction between material and immaterial labor doesn't hold. When you're washing a child, is that material or immaterial? Right? When you're taking care of a person, of a person's body, that washing them, when you're doing elder care, when you're taking care of somebody who is ill, etc., is that material or immaterial? If you deprive their work of any emotionality, of any intellectual, emotional dimension, right? Then the work, then you are a machine. And then the work is not really well done. Then it's work that makes the other person suffer. Because even certain services, material services, have to be done in a way that keep into account the dignity of that person. Who are done in a way that does not humiliate. Who are done in a way that does give hope. That does give, that's the generosity also that comes in. Have to be done in a way to recognize that that person has a whole world of feelings. And, and that's where also reciprocity has to come in, right? So tell your friends, that's reproduction, right? And also when you're cooking with in mind the health, right? It's not so easy, for example, to refuse their work and to deal with their work in a way you can deal, you know, if you are making a car. Of course, in a car, making a car too, you have to think of the well-being of people who will use it. But it's much more removed. And you are not the seller of the car, even though, of course, you have to have some responsibility for it. But when you're dealing with a human being, right, then that relationship, it's a very particular relationship. And what I'm saying is that that work that in our society is completely degraded. In fact, it's not even seen as work. There are many struggles today. Today, women are still struggling to have the work recognized as work. Like in New York, domestic workers in New York, paid domestic workers, only in November 2010, won the Bill of Rights, their Bill of Rights. It took, imagine, in this country, it took to arrive to 2010 to get a Bill of Rights, to say domestic workers are workers.
Well, would you say racism has a big to do with that?
Big thing, yeah. But you see, it's very interesting because that's the connection between racism and reproduction, right? Because the degradation of reproduction has also meant that it's always people who in society were degraded. They were those who were assigned to do this work. There has been the double degradation of people of color that this has been imposed and institutionalized, and the degradation of reproductive work have gone hand in hand. So you find, right, that this work really is the center of our existence. It's the support system that we have. You know, it's also work that is always done by people who are the lowest paid, right? The lowest considered. It's very interesting. There's really an aspect of this. So we have to change that. You know, we have to change that. You know, when I was younger, I was involved in a campaign for wages for housework. For many, many years, wages for housework. Because we thought that this was a way to show that this is real work. And it's real work that every business profit from. And the state profit from. The whole capitalist spectrum of
subsidization.
Yeah, well, we're subsidizing.
Subsidy, basically.
Yeah.
It allows
It's a
Yeah, let's take one or two more questions just so that we can actually...
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I didn't see it, actually.
That's okay. I have a question about the relationship between the commons and time, particularly around reproduction. A lot of queer theory especially has posited reproduction as related and wrapped up with ideas of futurity, which are always already ideologized. And you can really see that in the financializations of futures and sort of the way we think of progress narratives and linear time. And I was wondering how you thought of the temporality of the commons. Is it a different attunement to time?
Well, I mean, I think that the temporality, when we think of temporality of common, I mean, it's a different temporality because if you're thinking of a non-capitalist framework, right, the time of capitalism is a tailorized time, right? So it's a time that is basically related to the profit making, and therefore, and I think that in the commons, in that way, it's a completely different temporality. And one of the also, one thing that just came to mind because we were talking about reproduction and procreation. Think of the temporality of birth giving, right? Today, not only birth giving, now it's performed in a very individualized base, with the doctor as the life giver instead of the woman. The woman is like strapped with every pore, But also the temporality, in many cases today, in many hospitals, you have a certain amount of time to give birth, right? You got your 2 hours. If you don't deliver the child in those 2 hours, then you have a cesarean cut. I guess it varies from hospital to hospital. So that is again, particularly when we speak of reproduction of human beings, right? You are dealing with a temporality which is the opposite of that of capitalism. Because it's a temporality also which is structured over millions of years of evolutionary life, right? In other words, we have certain needs that have been built to us in our bodies. So we have a temporality which is so every time you're really dealing with the reproduction of another person, you enter a very different temporal scheme. So I'd say that yes, definitely, there is a completely qualitative different temporality to the process of reproduction. Yes, yeah.
I guess I just had a historical question, maybe
Sure.
about the wages for housework movement
Mm-hmm.
and your own experience of the feminist movement.
Mm-hmm.
I guess my very limited understanding is that the wages for housework movement and the feminist movement in Italy was very influenced by a kind of feminist philosophy of difference, which had to do with the notion that the women's movement shouldn't simply try to replicate and achieve equality on the terms that capitalism and patriarchy had set, right? That it should be something, utterly different, and it attributed this kind of incredible difficulty and agency to the movement. And I know it was influenced by, say, Carla Lonzi or maybe Lucy Irigary's work or whoever it was. I don't know. I don't know so much, but okay. But whoever it was influenced by, and I think maybe that's like a little hard to understand in the American context to some extent because it seemed like it got so caught up with the debate around essentialism. A little bit in academia.
Okay. So let me say.
But I mean, it just seems to like wonderfully inform your work. I think in a really like incredibly progressive way, which might also be like just about parsing the difference between what the gender roles are now and how they can be used for a really great and progressive purpose, and not essentialized as fixed or set. Yeah.
Okay, so I would say completely throw away your sources because the women's movement, the wages for house movement in Italy had nothing, not the palest resemblance to how it is described. Not at all.
Okay.
Not at all. Completely no.
There's
And nothing
so
to do with
little in
Carla Lonzi.
translation.
And nothing to do also with the philosophy of difference, because that's a particular school which has nothing to do with the wages for house. Actually, I was involved because I was in the United States, but the campaign for wages for house for a number of years, for a brief period, was an international campaign. So it was here in the United States as well.
Yeah.
And it was in Italy, in other countries, and we shared not only a continuous practice, but also a certain perspective. So I speak from real direct knowledge of it, and it's not, so in terms of today, I want to say that I'm very concerned that about this desire, for example, in some quarters, communization theory to abolish gender.
Yeah.
Or the whole idea, for example, the resistance that sometimes feminists as well have to the idea that feminists should take an initiative on reproduction, because again there is the fear that we're going to institutionalize women in reproduction. And to me these are profoundly mistaken concepts, and maybe I'll go over it 2 minutes on each of them because I think that there's so much misunderstanding about it that pains me. And I'd like to hear what you think about my argument. You know, it seems to me that, for example, the people who want to abolish gender, right, who think that if we maintain any notion of gender, for example, if you say, I am a woman, or if you say, I am a man, you're going to confirm oppression. That's crudely put, I think, is the theory, right? I think that in fact, they are the essentializers. They are the essentializer because they give to this concept, woman and man, a fixed meaning. In my own lifetime, the concept of what it means to be a woman has changed so much. What my mother thought about being a woman, and what I think being a woman, and what I think new generations think about being a woman is very different. Right? One thing is exploitation. Exploitation is bad under every sun, under every ages. Being a woman has been exploited. Gender has been exploited in capitalism and also in other systems. So we want to give up the exploitation. We want to destroy the exploitation. But why cannot be being gender or one particular? I can foresee a world, the future, in which we'll have 5, 6, 7 gender. Yeah. Provided the gender does not become a principle of exploitation, of ranking, of imposed codes, right? Of divisions of labor that actually mutilate the person. This is what we should be concerned with. And the idea that if I don't say woman, I'm not exploited any longer, well, that's a linguistic revolution. You know, you don't make, you don't make revolution. You don't say, oh, I will not say I'm a slave. Let me not say I'm a slave. You know, but if you are a slave, actually the moment you say, I am a slave, you're putting a distance between you and the slavery. It's like when we began to say, we are all housewives. That was very liberating. It was saying, we are all housewives. And the moment you recognize it, you really, in a sense, distance yourself from it. In fact, the worst moment of exploitation is when you're so identified that you don't even see, you know, But in any case, there's nothing wrong with being a woman. There's wrong when womanhood becomes exploited, becomes an instrument of exploitation. And that is what we have to fight. You know? And the question of reproduction, when women say, but why should I do reproduction? It should be also, this should be a problem, because why? It seems to me that there too, there is an acceptance of the idea that reproduction has to be drudgery. There's an acceptance of the idea that reproduction is a degrading, that somehow it's okay to build a car, but it's not okay to take care, which doesn't mean that any human being should be confined to reproductive activities. I'm not suggesting that, but I'm suggesting that reproductive activities are not worse, if anything, more interesting, more creative potentially. That what has made reproduction such a drudgery has been the organization of it and the exploitation of it. You know, first of all, as unpaid labor, so that it means that you have to be dependent. It means that you have less social power. It means that you don't have hours. It means that you're working from morning to night, Sunday, Christmas, Easter, etc., that you'll never retire, etc. And also it means that you perform it in a way that is being totally isolated, which was not true in the past. For example, in many societies, it was a collective. And so you're working in a situation that exhausts your energy, that in fact makes your life basically a life of imprisonment. So this is what we need to. But in fact, reproductive work, we have to recognize that this can be creative work. So when actually people say, oh my God, no, reproduction, this to me is an acceptance, again, of a situation which is now, and instead of fighting against the degradation, we fight against the reproduction. And which means that we cannot reconceptualize it in a different way. Yeah. Yes.
My name is Veronica. I'm actually from the Bronx, and I'm from that other side, and I think that the discussion begins, like you said, in the kitchen,
Yeah.
and in our communities, and knowing that if you are from the privilege, or even if you're not, we all have something in common. I mean, I think like the next greatest revolution should be we should be discussing our food. I mean, more people, and that has to do with the commons, right? And
Yes.
closure of the commons, patenting life, Monsanto.
Yes, Monsanto, which just received this incredible, green light.
And I think that we get caught up in like all this stuff, all this fear that we hold on to, ageism, sexism, racism, and we're so constructed to believe that capitalism is rational, but it really goes against human nature, and it goes against being a human being. And I think once people, whether you're from the east side, the west side, once we start coming into each other's communities, and without that fear, and we open those dialogues and barbecue with each other, like then we can think of maybe of like what Dolores Hayden said, and
Yes.
her new construction of like maybe building having different architecture and building a different
Yes.
infrastructure, because we can't sustain ourselves on just this alone and being alone. And it definitely goes like down to the communal I
The
don't know,
grand
because we're such
domestic,
in a state of
grand
emergency.
domestic revolution, yes.
Right, because we're such in this messy state because of capitalism, and but we're kind of, it's hard to see things sometimes when you're in the moment, and we see all this. We think we have so much choice because we have between Pantene Pro-V and I don't know, Bedhead,
Yeah.
but it's really all toxic, and all these like you said, I'm sorry, all these processes that are occurring. We don't see, and they want to take geography out of the existence of like globalization or what's happening, but like by saying that the world is flat and we have the computer and everybody has access to everything, but there's still people carrying bananas on their heads.
Yeah, that's
So-
you're raising a lot of good questions. Like just the last one, you know, the computer, for instance, right? The computer. One of the criticism I have of people who are speaking about the computer as a common. So, of course, the internet. I'm not denying that there is not a certain dimension of commoning that the computer has made possible, or face. On the other hand, I'm very, very worried that the praise and celebration of the internet that I've seen over the year has not been accompanied by a critique of the technology of it, and what the cost of that technology. You know, now we're beginning to get documentation connecting, for example, Hewlett Packard and so on, to the militias in the Congo, to the fact that, those wars have been fomented because the Congo is an incredibly rich place as far as mineral, very poor. They're one of the poorest as far as people, but one of the richest as far as minerals. They have practically everything. And so that's why the country has been so martyred. You know, it's been continuously colonized and recolonized and so on. And so, you know, to have a computer, we cannot even see what the computer allows by looking at what we can do. We have to see from the beginning, how do you produce a computer? You know, it takes 300 tons of soil to be sorted out for one personal computer, and then an infinite amount of clean water. I'd forgotten but it's a very high level of water. This is for a personal computer. Where is there water, and where is there soil going to come from? From somebody's common. From somebody's common land, most likely in Africa or in parts of China. So how can we say computer equal common when in fact people are beginning to speak of blood computer, like used to speak of bloody diamond, a blood computer, because there's so much blood trail in the history of a computer. So this is an example where we cannot, we need to look at the production. And also I'm glad you mentioned Dolores Hayden, because she speaks, now shifting to another dimension, but Dolores Hayden has written beautiful books, like one, The Grand through almost the 30s, right, who basically were concerned with the reorganization of reproduction in a more cooperative way. and particularly with breaking down some of the isolations, right? So they were rethinking the kitchen, rethinking the relation of the home to the neighborhood, right? In such a way. So we need people that are common in architecture, right? To rethink how we rebuild our homes. I'm in an article that I wrote called probably Feminism and the Politics of the Commons. Maybe it was made available for this gathering. I don't know. Okay, Feminism and you can get it on the internet, where I speak of some of the issues that I've spoken about tonight. I speak, but there I mention the women still from Latin America of the MST, the Movement Sem Terra, the people, the landless people of Brazil, who have fought for many, many years, you know, around basically, they have squatted an immense territory, you know, in which this is a very story that if you don't know it, you should familiarize yourself, because there's some interest, there's a lot of horror happening in this world, but there's been also some very interesting development, particularly in Latin America, where you've had, you know, very long protected land struggles and also struggles for control over the territory, not only land, but territory. So that not only the Zapatista, but the Movement Sem Terra, the landless people of Brazil, have occupied a lot of land, and on their land they've begun to organize production which they control. They have organized more than 1,000 schools that are built on the principle of self-education. Self-education means that you start educating yourself beginning from your life, beginning from your surrounding, right? Beginning from your needs, from your community, and then you begin the process of education, not from some abstract principle, but then from there you build. So the women, and this they have won after many, many battles, you know, with the landowners, losing people killed by death squads. So the women have been extremely important. In fact, interesting enough, the more the battle became bloody, the more the women became involved. They would be there like in the front line because to push back, you know, the attack that were coming from the landowner. After the land was won, after the squatters were becoming in the position of building more permanent communities, because now the land was declared theirs, and the question of building the housing, the infrastructure, then the women became very important. And they said, many cases, they insisted that the way the village be built, it be built in a way that it was very compact, where the houses would be close to each other. Why? Because they wanted to continue to do domestic work collectively, also with men, but collectively, not alone. And they wanted to be in a position to help each other if their husband or others abused them. So they would scream and people could hear them. And so the principle of the common is also a place of collective production, but also defense, right, was very, very important, you know. And so in some cases where the women didn't have enough power, the squatters built houses scattered here and there. But in many cases, and I spoke with some women years ago, and they said, no, we insisted that we all group together, because in the struggle our strength was being together, and we did everything collectively, and we wanted to continue that. That's a common, you know, that not only you produce together, but you also, and the importance of that. And yeah. Okay, thank you.